Good evening, folks. This is going to be an online lesson covering material on the spinal cord, spinal nerves, and spinal reflexes, trying to get us a little bit caught up on where we are at in class, since we are a little behind on that content at the moment. So let's just get down to speed here. The relevant handout for this information is the packet from Blackboard. If you go into the um, Blackboard site with your course documents, under handouts and lecture notes, you've got a packet of lecture notes entitled Spinal Cord, Spinal Nerves, and Somatic Reflexes. All the terminology that you will need will be in there, as well as all the diagrams that I will be referencing will be in there as well. Now, you already know a little bit about this. We've been dealing with central nervous system up till now. Brain has been the focus of our discussion. Spinal cord is part of the central nervous system as well, and it's kind of the bridge between the central and peripheral nervous system. It's the conduit that connects the brain to the rest of the lower body, but it is itself a central nervous system structure. It is a band of nervous tissue that is about as thick as one of your fingers. It is going to originate from the medulla oblongata, extend from there down through the vertebral canal that is formed by all of the vertebrae, and extend as far down as about L1. It's not going to go all the way down the spine. That's important. Not going to go all the way down the full length of the spinal cord. Uh, Protruding from the spine at regular intervals, we are going to find spinal nerves, which form most of the peripheral nervous system, along with the cranial nerves, of course, that branch out from the brain itself. The spinal cord, of course, is central nervous system. The spinal nerves that branch out from it are peripheral nervous system. We're going to be talking about both of them in the course of this lesson. Now, the spinal cord, we're going to begin with there, has a couple of different functions. Its most obvious function is signal conduction. The spinal cord is going to be transmitting information up and down the body. It's going to allow communication between different levels of the trunk. It's also going to allow communication between the body and the brain. It's going to transmit sensory information up to the brain. It's going to carry motor signals from the brain down to effectors throughout the body. And it's going to allow input from one level of the body to reach output at other levels of the body. So it's basically going to be our signal conduction bridge for a lot of levels of nervous system communication below the level of the head. Secondly, spinal cord is going to carry out a lot of important roles in locomotion. It contains bundles of nerve fibers known as the central pattern generators, which coordinate repetitive muscle contractions that are initially signaled by the brain. Although the brain sends out the initial signal that says, here's the movement I want to do, the spinal cord is going to coordinate a lot of that action, allowing you, for example, to alternate the movements of your legs and arms back and forth in the proper sequence whenever you're walking or taking other sequential actions that require specific movement of muscles in particular patterns. And finally, the spinal cord is carrying out a wide variety of spinal reflexes that do not involve the input of the brain. The spinal cord does a lot of signal processing of its own. It controls numerous involuntary responses to stimuli, such as pulling you back from painful stimuli before the brain even gets involved. It will eventually send a signal to the brain, but the spinal cord makes several initial decisions on its own about numerous reflex actions to protect you from pain, maintain balance, and otherwise coordinate basic immediate muscular responses. Now, some basic spinal cord structure. It's this thick cylinder of nervous tissue, originates from the foramen magnum, goes down the vertebral column. When you are in fetal development, it goes as far down as L5, goes basically down to the base of the vertebrae at the bottom of the sacrum. By the time you're born, however, the thickening of the vertebrae has begun to outpace it. By the time you're born, it only goes as far as L3. By the time you reach adulthood, it only goes to L1. So basically, your spinal cord stays the same length during your development, but the vertebrae keep getting bigger and bigger and eventually outgrow it. Average spinal cord is about 45 centimeters long, and it's about 1.8 centimeters in thickness. Along its length, it gives rise to 31 pairs of spinal nerves. That number is very consistent, not only across humans, but across most mammals. Virtually all mammals have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which exit the spinal cord and pass through the intervertebral foramina, openings in the vertebrae, to reach out into the body as a whole. The spinal cord is often said to be divided into segments, which are the sections of the spinal cord supplied by each nerve pair. There's not visible segmentation in the spinal cord. That's just simply a way that we describe the section of the spinal cord served by a given pair of spinal nerves. Along its length, you'll see that the spinal cord has grooves in its surface. There's a ventral groove on the front surface and a dorsal groove on its back surface. We call those the median fissures, the dorsal median fissure and the ventral median fissure. And those grooves allow division of the spinal cord into a couple of distinct regions. Kind of has like an H-like shape because of that. We often say that the spinal cord is divided into cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. Those are named for its developmental levels of origin during fetal development, not where they are located in the adult body, because as we indicated before, the spine is going to outpace its growth as we get older. Spinal cord is thicker in the cervical region near the neck, where the nerves of the upper limbs originate. We call that the cervical enlargement. It is also thicker in the its bottom end, the so-called lumbar region, where the nerves of the lower limbs originate. We sometimes call that the pelvic enlargement as well. Immediately inferior to the lumbar or pelvic enlargement is what we call the medullary cone. It's a cone-shaped mass of gray matter at the base of the spinal cord, also called the conus medullaris. From the medullary cone, we're going to see a bundle of nerve fibers extending away called the cauda equina, which literally means the horse's tail because it kind of looks like the fibers of the tail of a horse. The cauda equina extends from L2 all the way down to S5 at the base of the sacrum. The nerve fibers of the cauda equina innervates the pelvic organs and the various lower limbs. Now, like the brain, the spinal cord is going to be protected by meninges. And in fact, they are literally the same meninges that protect the brain. They extend down from the cranial cavity into the vertebral cavity, surrounding the brain and then surrounding the spinal cord as well. So we have the dura mater, the tough layer of dense, irregular connective tissue that extends around the brain and then continues down into the vertebral column, forming this loose fitting sheath around the spinal cord, sometimes called the dural sheath. The space between the dura mater and the vertebrae themselves is sometimes called the epidural space. The epidural space contains lots of blood vessels, lots of loose connective tissue, areolar connective tissue, and lots of fatty tissue. This is where we inject epidural anesthesia. If you hear of somebody getting an epidural, during childbirth or during certain operations, that is where it is injected into the epidural space between the dural sheath and the vertebral column. Now, deep to that, we find the arachnoid mater, which adheres to the underside of the dural sheath, much like the arachnoid mater surrounding the brain. It's kind of got a webby-looking appearance. And then beneath that, there is a subarachnoid space, just like around the brain, where you're going to find your cerebrospinal fluid. And then you're going to find a pia mater, which, much like the brain, adheres closely to the surface of the spinal cord. The pia mater is actually going to continue beyond the medullary cone at the base of the spinal cord. It's going to continue as this clear filament of connective tissue that extends past the spinal cord. We call that bit the terminal phylum. It's going to merge with the coccygeal ligament, a ligament at the base of the coccyx, and it's going to anchor the spinal cord at its inferior end to the first coccygeal vertebra, sort of holding it in place at the bottom. Along the length of the spinal cord, you'll also see other tiny little ligaments extending away from the pia mater, sort of horizontal ligaments called the denticulate ligaments that extend from the pia mater through the arachnoid mater and link to the dura mater, anchoring the spinal cord in place and preventing it from shifting too much side to side as you move. I'll show you a diagram of all this so it's not quite so abstract, and this is straight out of your handout for today. Okay, here we go. There's the spinal cord. Here you can see those grooves that I mentioned before, the median fissures, the ventral and dorsal median fissures. Here is the spinal cord itself. You will note in the spinal cord, the white matter is on the outside and the gray matter is on the inside. That's the reverse of what we see in the brain, where the gray matter is on the outer surface and the white matter is on the inner surface. More about that in a minute. Here you see the pia mater. Note how closely it clings to the outer surface of the spinal cord. Here is the arachnoid mater, not labeled on here, but you can see there's a gap between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. That's the subarachnoid space where the cerebrospinal fluid will be circulating. You would occasionally see denticulate ligaments extending from the pia mater through that space, passing through the arachnoid mater, and linking with the dura mater, which would be the dural sheath that we were talking about a minute ago. I'm going to scroll up here for a sec here as well. Here is a look at our spinal cord. Here's the brain. Here you can see the spinal cord extending down. There's the conus medullaris. You see we're not near the pelvis yet. And there's the cauda equina, that bundle of nerve fibers extending away from there. Let me enlarge this a little bit for you to view better. So yeah, you can see that we terminate the spinal cord right here about L1, and there are the nerve fibers of the cauda equina extending down towards the pelvis. And there's the cauda medullaris, that little cone-shaped mass right there. And then here you can see the various spinal nerves extending away from the spinal cord. You can see that for the most part, you have a number of spinal nerves equal to the number of vertebrae of that type. You have 5 sacral nerves, 5 lumbar nerves, 12 thoracic nerves. One difference here is that you have 8 cervical nerves where there are only 7 cervical vertebrae. And you have 1 coccygeal nerve, even though there are multiple coccygeal vertebrae fused together to make the coccyx. Okay. Now, when we're talking about the organization of the spinal cord, like I said, it's a little different than the brain. That the brain has the gray matter on the outside forming the cortex and the white matter forming the tracts on the inside. In the spinal cord, the gray matter is on the inside and the white matter is on the outside. In the spinal cord, the gray matter forms that sort of H-shaped core with very little myelination. That is where the data processing of the spinal cord takes place. The gray matter of the spinal cord is organized into 4 masses. We've got the 2 dorsal horns, which extend towards the back and sides of the body, the dorsolateral direction, you might say, and the 2 ventral horns, which extend towards the front and sides of the body, the ventrolateral direction, connected by a bridge of gray matter called the gray commissure. Now, in the middle of the gray commissure, there is going to be, at least when you're born, there's what's called the central canal. It's going to be a passageway filled with cerebrospinal fluid. By the time you are an adult, it has collapsed in almost all cases. In young children, it's usually open and filled with cerebrospinal fluid. In some cases, there will be little pockets of fluid in the adult spine, but for the most part, it is closed up in the adult spine. Now, spinal nerves approaching the spinal cord are going to split into dorsal and ventral roots, which will approach those dorsal and ventral horns. And there's a division of labor there. The dorsal roots are the afferent branches coming into the spinal cord. They bring in sensory data. The ventral roots are actually outgoing. They're the efferent fibers going away from the spinal cord. They're carrying away motor data. Let me actually show you another diagram here real quick to show you what I am talking about. Okay, so here's a cross-sectional view of the spinal cord seen from the side. So here is our spinal cord as you see it. This is cross-sectional view seen. This is the front here. There is the ventral median fissure. A little more closed up here is the dorsal median fissure. Here's our gray matter. Here's the gray commissure joining up the 2 halves. Here are our 2 ventral roots. Here are our ventral horns, excuse me. Here are our 2 dorsal horns pointing towards the back of the body. Ventral horns point towards the front of the body. White matter, you can see, surrounds them on all sides. Here's an incoming spinal nerve on either side, and you can see that it splits into dorsal and ventral roots. Dorsal roots. Here is the cell body of the sensory neuron. We call this a dorsal root ganglion. That's a cluster of sensory neurons. And here's the dorsal root bringing in sensory data coming into the spinal cord. So your sensory data always comes into the dorsal horn via the dorsal roots. Now, here are the ventral roots. The ventral roots, these are carrying away the motor data. The motor neurons originate inside the ventral horns. Their cell bodies are inside the spinal cord itself, and their axons go out as part of the spinal nerve. So motor data going out to the body goes out through the ventral roots. So to repeat that again, sensory data coming into the spinal cord comes in via the dorsal roots into the dorsal horn. Motor signals going out to the body go out through the dorsal horn into the the ventral horn into the ventral root. Dorsal brings sensory data in, ventral brings motor data out. So all the sensory stuff goes in the back of the spinal column. In other words, all the motor impulses, instructions to the body go out through the front. Now, you noted there that our gray matter was surrounded by white matter. The white matter of the spinal cord is highly myelinated, like white matter would be anywhere in the body, and is organized into tracts that carry data up and down the spinal cord. We often say that um, the white matter is arranged into columns or funiculi around the gray matter. And we'll talk about there being dorsal, lateral, and ventral columns or funiculi of white matter. Dorsal being the ones on the back between the dorsal horns, lateral being the ones to either side of the horns, and ventral being in the front between the ventral horns. Each of those columns of white matter, those funiculi, is subdivided into smaller tracts called fasciculi. Now, there are two kinds of tracts that you see, two kinds of tracts of white matter in the spinal cord. You have ascending tracts, which carry sensory data up the cord towards the brain, and descending tracts, which carry motor impulses down the spinal cord towards the body. A term you're going to hear a lot when we talk about the spinal cord is that many of these tracts of white matter are going to decussate. And if we say that a tract of white matter in the spinal cord decussates, what we are saying about it is that it crosses to the opposite side of the body as it passes up or down. In other words, signals that originate on the left side of the brain are going to ultimately control things happening on the right side of the body and vice versa. A significant percentage of the signals from your brain actually control things going on the opposite side of the body, precisely because so many of our spinal tracts decussate. They don't all decussate, but a great many of them do. And as a result, for the most part, left side of your brain controls right side of your body. Some are ipsilateral and do not decussate, but most do. Now, this gets to an interesting phenomenon that's worth mentioning, and that's the phenomenon of handedness, and the fact that for whatever reason, mammals, not just humans, tend to exhibit this interesting phenomenon of handedness, whereby we tend to have a dominant hand, that we have one hand that we are better with than another, that one side of our brain is dominant, that we are left-handed or we are right-handed. I'm right-handed. Most of you are probably right-handed because for reasons we're not clear on, in humans, that's the dominant pattern. 90 to 93% of humans are right-handed. We do not know why. This is not the case in all species. There are right-handed mammals. There are left-handed mammals, or right-pawed mammals, or left-pawed mammals. Some animals are more likely to lead with their right paw or their left paw. Watch cats and dogs, they tend to have a favored paw for a lot of activities. So that is handedness happens all across the animal kingdom, and some species favor the left and some favor the right. We do not know why. This is not clear. In humans, for whatever reason, somewhere between 90 and 93% of the population is right-handed. Somewhere between 7 and 10% is left-handed. The frequency of ambidexterity is not known. We're not 100% clear on how many people are truly ambidextrous, that meaning that they're equally good with both hands. Part of the reason for that is because there's no clinical test for this. Part of the reason for that is because we don't know how many people are actually ambidextrous and how many people have learned to be ambidextrous. Because particularly given that the world is mostly right-handed, a lot of folks who are genetically left-handed have by necessity had to teach themselves to be a bit ambidextrous just to function in a world that is largely designed around right-handed function. So we don't know to what extent a lot of people might actually be left-handed, but have learned some ambidexterity. And therefore, the extent to which some people who think they're ambidextrous are actually left-handed and have just learned ambidexterity is not clear. So that's why these numbers are not exact. It also doesn't help that in a lot of cultures, believe it or not, it is considered bad luck to be left-handed or even evil to be left-handed. And seems strange to hear that in the modern world, but as recently as not all that long ago, my younger sister in the 1980s had a teacher, a school teacher, I kid you not, in the 1980s, and we didn't go to a religious school or anything either. This was a public school teacher who told my mother that she hated teaching left-handed children because left-handed children were children of the devil. And yeah, that was not all that long ago, folks. My grandmother got punished every time she used her left-handed school. She got whacked on the knuckles with a ruler every time she tried. So this is not an old superstition. This was living memory that left-handedness was punished, was considered an evil thing, was considered a wicked thing. So in some cultures, that's still a belief. So yeah, for that reason, we don't know exact numbers on what percentage of humanity is left-handed because there are places you have to hide it. Okay, but let's talk a little bit about some of those tracts of white matter and what they do, because specific tracts of white matter in the spinal cord do specific things. They carry specific kinds of signals. Let's talk about the ascending tracts first. The ascending tracts of white matter carry signals of up the spine. They originate in sensory receptors. Usually they involve a chain of 3 neurons. There's a first order neuron that carries a signal from the sensory receptor to the spinal cord, or in some cases straight to the brainstem. Then there's a second order neuron that passes the signal from the spinal cord or brainstem to the thalamus. And then a third order neuron that passes the signal from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So usually there's a chain of 3 neurons involved in passing a sensory signal from its point of origin in a sensory receptor to the cerebral cortex where that signal gets processed. So only 3 neurons, 3 cells between whatever sensory receptor and the brain actually processing the signal. Now, there are a lot of different tracts of white matter, but the major tracts of white matter in the spine, I'm going to go through them here with you. There are 5 major tracts of ascending tracts in the spine. There is the gracile fasciculus, sometimes called by the older name fasciculus gracilis. It carries signals for vibration, visceral pain, that is pain from internal organs, deep touch, that is touch deep within your tissues. Discriminative touch, that is the ability to precisely locate on your body exactly where a touch is. And proprioception, your sense of where your body parts are relative to your location in space, like your ability to close your eyes and be able to say, I can tell where my hand is without looking, that kind of thing. And the gracile fasciculus carries all that data from the lower limbs and from the trunk below the level of about T6. Then there is the cuneate fasciculus, or fasciculus cuneatus. And if you're wondering the spelling of all these things, they're all in today's handout. The fasciculate cuneatus, so the cuneate fasciculus, fasciculatus, okay, you can use cuneate fasciculus or fasciculus cuneatus. I don't care which term you use. That one does all the same jobs as the gracile fasciculus, but it does all that stuff from the upper limbs and the chest from T6 on up. Then we have what's called the spinothalamic tract. The spinothalamic tract joins with several smaller tracts of white matter that we're not going to enumerate to form a group of tracts of white matter called the anterolateral system. Collectively, the anterolateral system carries data on pain, body temperature, pressure, tickling sensations, itching sensations, light touches, and what are called crude touches. So when I say crude touches, I don't mean like somebody touched you inappropriately. I mean like touch whose precise location is difficult to pinpoint. Like if somebody touches you on the back, you can't precisely tell exactly where the touch is as nicely as like you could tell exactly where on the back of your hand the touch is. Then we have the spino-reticular tracts. That's one that's also part of that anterolateral system, but I want to name it in particular because it has the very special job of carrying pain data from tissue injury to the reticular formation of the brain. So it's got a very important job in transmitting pain data. Now, all four of those tracts that I just named, the gracile fasciculus, the cuneate fasciculus, the spinothalamic tract, and the spinoreticular tract, all of those decussate. In other words, all of those transmit data to the opposite side of the brain from the part of the body where they came. Lastly, I have the dorsal and ventral spinocerebellar tracts. So you got one in the front, one in the back. They are ipsilateral. In other words, left goes to left, right goes to right. They don't decussate. Those carry proprioceptive data from your limbs and your trunk to the cerebellum, to the center of the brain that processes muscular coordination. And where proprioception is our sense of where body parts are in space, your ability to sense where the parts of your body are without looking at them. Okay. So those are the ascending tracts, the ones that carry sensory data up the spine. Then there are the descending tracts. Descending tracts are a bit different. They're all motor tracts. They're all transmitting instructions from the brain down the brainstem and down the spinal. They all involve only two neurons in their pathway. There's an upper motor neuron that begins in the cerebral cortex or brainstem. And that one will terminate. That's the upper motor neuron. So it originates in the cerebral cortex or brainstem. And then there's the lower motor neuron that will originate in the brainstem or spinal cord, and it will terminate at whatever structure, whatever effector is carrying out the instruction. So only two neurons lie between your brain and whatever structure is going to carry out an instruction. Now, the descending tracts of white matter that carry signals down the spinal cord. First, we have the lateral and ventral corticospinal tracts, also sometimes called the pyramidal tracts because they have kind of like a triangular or pyramid-like shape. Those decussate, they cross over to left to right side of the body and right to left side of the body. They transmit signals for precise, finely coordinated movements of your limbs. Then we have the tectospinal tracts. Those also decussate. You might recall the tectum is the region of your brain that allows for visual and auditory tracking, for following a sensory signal. So it should come as no surprise that the tectospinal tracts control reflexive turning of the head, allowing you to respond to sensory stimuli and turn your head to follow a sound or follow an object with your eyes. Then we have the lateral reticulospinal tract and the medial reticulospinal tract. The reticulospinal tracts control the movements of your limbs, particularly involving posture and balance. Within those tracts, we also find special nerve pathways called the descending analgesic pathways. Remember, analgesic means pain blocking. The descending analgesic pathways reduce pain signals going from the limbs to the brain to help modulate pain if painful things happen to you while you're moving around. Then we have the lateral vestibulospinal tracts and the medial vestibulospinal tracts. The lateral ones control the extensor muscles. Remember the extensor muscles from our muscular unit just recently, to keep your limbs stiff and straight when you're trying to maintain balance. Those ones decussate. The medial ones control the position of your head. And the medial ones are interesting because they have both ipsilateral and contralateral branches. So parts of them stay on the same side of the body, parts of them cross over. And then lastly, we have my favorite spinal tract, because when you teach anatomy, you have things like your favorite spinal tract, which is the rubrospinal tracts. Rubrospinal tracts are very commonly featured in your anatomical diagrams, but they're hard to find in human spines, because in human spines, they're very small, almost non-existent. They're vestigial in us for the most parts, because they assist in muscular coordination at a level that humans generally do not exhibit. Rubrospinal tracts, however, are much larger and better developed in many non-human animals that have much higher levels of muscular coordination than we do. There are much bigger rubrospinal tracts in your cat. There are much bigger rubrospinal tracts in chimpanzees and monkeys. And there are much better developed rubrospinal tracts in Olympic gymnasts and other people who have very high degrees of coordination. So it does seem that some humans are naturally better at those things. Doesn't mean if you have a better rubrospinal tract, you're going to be a gymnast, but it does seem that some people have natural advantages in that regard. Okay, so that's spinal cord structure for you. Let's talk for a few minutes about the spinal nerves that branch off from the spinal cord. carry those signals away from the spinal cord to the body as a whole. As I said, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. There are 8 cervical spinal nerves. There are 12 thoracic spinal nerves, 5 lumbar spinal nerves, 5 sacral spinal nerves, and 1 coccygeal spinal nerve. And these are all paired. So I guess you could say there are 62 spinal nerves, but these are down each side of the body. So 31 on each side. That's 31 pairs. We number them the same way we number vertebrae. So you've got C1 through C8. I know there are only 7 cervical vertebrae, but there's 1 spinal nerve between the skull and C1, which is why there are 8. So we've got C1 through C8, T1 through T12, L1 through L5, S1 through S5, and the coccygeal one is CO, is how they number it. It's capital C, little o. The cauda equina is going to form from segments between L2 and CO. Each of these spinal nerves has dorsal and ventral roots, as I mentioned before. Dorsal roots, and then each of those dorsal and ventral roots divides into 6 to 8 tinier branches called nerve rootlets. The dorsal rootlets enter the spinal cord to bring in sensory data. The ventral ones leave the spinal cord and come together to form this single ventral root to carry out motor data. Spinal nerves are mixed nerves. They're two-way nerves. They have a dorsal ramus that innervates muscles and joints in the region closest to them, and a ventral ramus that innervates the skin and muscles of the trunk and the area near them and gives rise to nerves of the limbs. There's a tinier meningeal branch that goes off each spinal nerve that re-enters the vertebral canal and then provides innervation to the meninges of the surrounding region. Each spinal nerve also gives off other nerves along its length. We call those the intercostal nerves. Those follow the ribs in the nearby region. Those intercostal nerves then will give rise to bundles of nerve fibers called nerve plexi, found in other parts of the body. Each spinal nerve, with the exception of C1, basically controls a band of tissue in the trunk of your body, like a band of muscle, a band of skin that it innervates, that it provides signals to, muscular signals and sensory signals, called its dermatome. Interesting thing about those dermatomes is they overlap each other. So that, like, okay, if I've got like a band of tissue controlled by spinal nerve 10, it overlaps the one controlled by 11 and the one controlled by 9. They all overlap each other a little bit. So what that means is that if you sever one spinal nerve, one of them gets damaged, it doesn't completely deaden that region of the body because 2 other spinal nerves near it also provide sensation and movement to that area. So you'd have to damage 3 spinal nerves in a row to completely deaden an entire area of the body. That's a sort of evolutionary mechanism for making sure that damage to one nerve does not completely deaden access to a whole area of the body. By the way, for any of you interested in going into anesthesia, that also means that if you want to anesthetize a part of the body for surgery or something, you have to anesthetize 3 consecutive nerves to deaden one area because 3 different nerves in a row are all providing sensation to that one band of tissue, that one dermatome. And therefore, you got to deaden this nerve, and that nerve if you want to cut here to make sure that that area has no sensation. Now, I'm not going to say too much more about that, but I am going to mention some common nerve pathologies. You've all heard the term neuralgia, I am sure. The term neuralgia is a general term for nerve pain. That can be caused for a lot of things. Neuralgia is a general term for any kind of nerve pain for a wide variety of reasons. Pressure on a nerve can lead to neuralgia. Damage to a nerve can cause that. A lot of times, neuralgia is caused by a herniated disc or an injured disc. Sometimes surgery or physical therapy can relieve that. You all heard the term peripheral neuropathy or nerve palsy. That's often a loss of sensation or motor function due to injury or trauma to a nerve, degeneration of a nerve due to a disease. Oftentimes, that's preceded, like loss of function is often preceded by abnormal sensations coming from a nerve, prickling feelings, burning feelings, numbness, tingling, all those weird feelings coming from a nerve are often collectively called paresthesias, and they can be accompanied by neuralgia as well. So, anytime anybody's feeling abnormal nerve feelings like that, you would want to investigate, find out is there something pinching the nerve, is there pressure on the nerve, some kind of physical cause that could be causing abnormal sensations to occur. And if there's no obvious physical impairment, you would want to look for nerve damage, nerve trauma, or nerve disease that's causing something more serious. Now, last but not least, let's take a look at some nerve reflexes, because this is one of the cool things the spinal cord does. The spinal cord manages a wide variety of reflex actions that the brain doesn't even have to be involved in. That the brain gets the signal eventually, but a lot of reflex actions are things that the body has to carry out very quickly and that the brain doesn't need to think about. And the spinal cord will say, I'm going to make the decision about this right now and then tell the brain what's going on later. A reflex is defined as a quick, involuntary, stereotyped response of a muscle or gland, meaning it's a thing that always works the same way when we say it's stereotyped to a particular stimulus. It's quick and it doesn't require you to think about it. Your body's glandular secretions, like salivation, the release of stomach juices, the release of hormones, all of those are reflex actions. But muscular actions can be reflex actions as well. Now, a lot of different reflex actions are going to be covered by the different organ systems we're going to talk about in A and P2. And when we talk about the endocrine system in about 2 weeks, everything the endocrine system is doing is a glandular reflex action. What I'm interested in right now are what we call somatic reflexes. Somatic reflexes, which are sometimes called spinal reflexes, are unlearned skeletal muscle actions. We call them spinal reflexes because the spinal cord generally takes care of them without the brain having to get immediately involved. Generally speaking, the way this works is through what's called a reflex arc. And the way that works is that receptors in the skin, muscle, or a tendon get stimulated. An afferent nerve fiber sends a signal from the receptor to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. So-called integrating centers, which consist of interneurons in the gray matter of the spinal cord or sometimes the brainstem, determine that a reflex response is needed. Efferent nerve fibers send out a motor impulse to the relevant muscle, and the muscle executes the response. The brain doesn't need to get involved. The brain gets the message, but usually a fraction of a second later, after the muscle has already carried out the necessary response to what is usually a situation that requires immediate action. A lot of these somatic reflexes involve what are called muscle spindles. Muscle spindles involve sensory receptors called proprioceptors that inform the brain about the length and movements of a muscle. Muscle spindles are quite abundant in skeletal muscles that need very fine-tuned motor control. You have as many as 100 or more muscle spindles per gram of muscle in your hands and your feet, which require a lot of fine-tuning of their control. Large muscles have a lot fewer spindles. There are none of them in muscles that don't need fine-tuning of control, like your ears. Spindles are long receptors. They're 4 to 10 millimeters long, and each one consists of 3 to 10 muscle fibers called intrafusal fibers, um, wrapped around a couple of nerve fibers and a capsule of connective tissue. When the muscle is at rest or stretched or relaxed, the spindle will send a steady stream of signals to the brain, telling the brain how long it is. We call that its steady state or its tonic response. But when the muscle changes length, shortens, contracts, or whatever, suddenly that sends a signal saying, hey, something's changed here. That tells the brain how the length of the muscle is changing and how fast its length is changing. That's its dynamic or phasic response. That allows for a quick reflex adjustment in what the muscle is doing, which we call a corrective reflex. This, for example, would be needed to change the tension in muscles to maintain your balance. If, for example, you're shifting your feet and you need to rapidly make changes in the position of your feet or your ankles to maintain your balance on uneven ground. Now, there are a couple of very specific muscular reflex actions that I want to mention. There are 3 specific muscle reflexes managed by the spinal cord that I want to talk about. First, there's a thing called the stretch reflex. The stretch reflex is the contracting and stiffening of a muscle when it's stretched out to help you maintain your balance. This serves to help stabilize your joints, smooth out your movements, and coordinate complicated actions like dancing or sports actions like, running or swinging a tennis racket or any other kind of complicated sets of bodily movements. The stretch reflex is usually initiated by the brain unless the muscle is stretched very suddenly, in which case, suddenly, the brain is going to kick in with a spinally controlled, the spine is going to kick in with a very sudden tendon reflex. Like when you guys tapped your knees with a little tendon hammer and lap, we call that like the patellar knee jerk. If you suddenly stretch out a tendon very, very rapidly, then the reflex action of stiffening it to maintain balance will kick in almost immediately to make sure you don't just fall over. Some examples of this include the calcaneal tendon reflex, which will plantar flex your foot to help maintain balance. The triceps brachii tendon reflex, which will extend your elbow in order to keep your balance by extending your arm. And the masseter reflex, which will clench your jaw tightly so you don't accidentally bite your tongue. A lot of reflex tests that we do are testing for the stretch reflex and make sure that you still have strong reflex actions to make sure that reflexes have not been damaged by things like peripheral neuropathy from diabetes, from multiple sclerosis, from syphilis, from damage due to alcoholism, or even from simple things like electrolyte imbalances. Now, another important spinal reflex is the flexor reflex, also called the withdrawal reflex. This is a quick reflex action that contracts flexor muscles to pull one of your limbs away from something injurious. This is a defensive reflex to pull you away from painful stimulus. The classic examples being stepping on something sharp and pulling your left foot back from it, or jerking your hand away from a hot stove. The way this flexor or withdrawal reflex works is that pain receptors will send a signal to the interneurons of the spinal cord. That will quickly send a response back to the motor neurons of the flexor muscles in the affected limb. The muscles will then flex and withdraw the limb before you even become consciously aware of the pain, which is why you will often find you jerk your hand back, and then a moment later, it's like, oh, ow, that hurt. This is a complex reflex arc. We call it a polysynaptic reflex arc because it will often sustain the avoidance mechanism until you become aware of the pain, at which point voluntary things can kick in and you become consciously aware of what the problem was, and you can stay back from it to prevent further harm. Interesting thing about the flexor reflex is that it's accompanied by what's called a crossed extension reflex, which means that when you flex one muscle, you extend muscles in the opposite limb to maintain your balance. So you don't just fall over. The classic example is if you step on a sharp thing and you withdraw one limb, you basically are going to stiffen the other limb to bear the body weight at the same time. That way, you don't end up just tipping over whenever you pulled your foot away from the sharp thing that you stepped on. So the flexor response is what's considered to be an ipsilateral reflex arc. Basically, the sensory input and the motor output are on the same side of the body. You got pain on the left foot when you stepped on something sharp, so you uh, pulled the left foot away from the sharp thing. The crossed extension reflex to maintain your balance is a contralateral reflex arc. The pain was on the left side of your body, so you stiffened your right leg to maintain your balance. All this works at the same time to help you not only avoid the pain, but to make sure that you're keeping your posture at the same time. And finally, we have a thing called the Golgi tendon reflex. You have to capitalize the G in Golgi. It's like just so many things in anatomy, named after a person, named after Camillo Golgi, who was an Italian physiologist and physician that a lot of things in anatomy are named for. The Golgi tendon reflex is a reflex in response to excessive tension on a tendon to prevent us from damaging our tendons. Many of our tendons contain tiny little sensory organs, about 1 millimeter each, called Golgi tendon organs. They are proprioceptors, that is, sensors of location within our tendons, located near the place where the tendon joins the muscle. Nerve fibers wrapped into the collagen allow us to basically send a signal from that organ to the spinal cord. Now, when a tendon is relaxed, there's not much pressure on those nerve endings. But when we contract the muscle and that pulls on the tendon, the collagen fibers wrapped around those nerve fibers squeeze those nerve endings and send a signal to the spinal cord based on the degree of tension at that joint. The Golgi tendon reflex will inhibit motor neurons at the muscle to reduce the strength of the contraction to avoid tearing the tendon if the tension gets too high. This is basically a way of making sure we do not overstimulate a muscle to make certain that we don't damage ourselves when we're doing too much work. It will reflexively cause the shifting of burden to other motor units. Prevents overstimulating muscle fibers and more even distribution of a workload within a muscle and to other nearby muscles. Helps us to do things like maintain a grip and prevent us from pulling and tearing muscles and tendons. The whole thing I was talking about when we talked about muscle groups earlier this semester with multiple motor unit summation, that we basically are trying to make sure that work is shifted from one motor unit within a muscle to the other. The Golgi tendon reflex is how we do that. Now, if you have very sudden, rapid muscle movements accompanied by very powerful muscles, sometimes that can unfortunately lead to a tendon being torn and damaged before the reflex action kicks in, and that can result in sometimes severe injuries. A ruptured calcaneal tendon, that is Achilles tendon, that is sometimes exactly how that happens. Basically, a sudden, sharp, rapid movement there can rupture that tendon before the reflex action can kick in to protect it. Okay, folks, this has been a quick survey of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves and some of the reflexes that they mediate. I hope this has been helpful to all of you. On the basis of what I have just given you, you now have the information you need to do your spinal cord and spinal reflexes quiz, which I will be posting to Blackboard momentarily. You will have this quiz available for 1 week. It will be up until next Sunday night. I will see you all in class next time we get together. We will be talking about senses rather than the spinal cord. And I will talk to you later. You have a good rest of your evening.